Welcome to the debate. Imagine you are tasked with cleaning up a massive, sprawling, heavily polluted industrial site.
Okay.
There's a certain logic to starting with the most visible mess, right? I mean, you scrub the giant smokestacks right by the front gates because they're towering over everything. And, well, everyone driving by sees them.
Right. It's about the immediate optics. You want to show the public you're actually doing something. You want that progress to be highly visible and undeniable.
Exactly. But what if, instead of tackling the main factory floor, where the real pollution is happening, everyone just fixates on a single delivery truck parked out back?
Just one truck.
Yeah, a truck that is actually incredibly fuel efficient, but it happens to run on diesel and has, a bit of visible soot on the bumper. Meanwhile, the main furnace inside the plant is just spewing completely unregulated black smoke through the roof vents, and everyone just ignores it.
Well, that is the perfect definition of a regulatory blind spot. We absolutely love a shiny, photogenic solution in climate policy, even if it's completely disproportionate to the actual root of the problem.
And that brings us to the core of our discussion today: the intense, really accelerating global push to decarbonize the maritime shipping industry. We are seeing unprecedented, aggressive regulatory efforts to force international shipping down to zero emissions. And of course, we're seeing an equally intense pushback from the industry itself.
We really are. And to genuinely ground this conversation, we're drawing directly from a fascinating piece of analysis from the Deep Draft, written by Captain Raghu Sharma. The article is provocatively titled, "Shipping is not the villain, it's the scapegoat of the climate debate."
Now, my position today is that aggressive global regulation of shipping isn't just justified. It's a strategic, absolutely necessary, and highly effective lever for global climate action. When you look at the absolute emissions and the unique international nature of the industry, it's the perfect candidate for unified global frameworks to drive the technological breakthroughs we desperately need everywhere else.
And my position is that shipping is being disproportionately targeted and, well, essentially scapegoated for political convenience. It's bearing the brunt of global climate theater, taking on massive financial and operational burdens, while vastly larger domestic polluters are just avoiding anything resembling the same level of scrutiny.
I think we need to start by looking at the sheer scale of the numbers, because this is where the argument for strict regulation becomes, to me, undeniable. We can talk about percentages all day, but the atmosphere only cares about absolute emissions, right?
Sure, absolute numbers matter.
Right. And in 2023, international shipping emitted roughly 900 million tons of carbon dioxide. 900 million tons. If shipping were a sovereign country, it would be the 6th or 7th largest emitter in the world.
Look, it's a large number in a vacuum. Absolutely. I'm not denying the math there.
It's a colossal number. And we also have to confront the environmental reality of what is actually being burned out there on the oceans. Historically, ships burn heavy fuel oil. And for those who aren't familiar, this isn't the refined gas you put in your car.
No, not at all.
It's essentially the bottom of the barrel from the refining process. It's a thick, tar-like sludge that's left over when all the lighter, cleaner fuels have been boiled off. Even after the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, introduced the 2020 sulfur cap, which, yes, successfully cut sulfur oxide emissions by 80%, the fundamental reality is that burning this leftover sludge is incredibly carbon intensive.
It's carbon intensive, yes, but the proportional context is absolutely crucial here.
But the context is that shipping operates outside of single country jurisdictions. Regulating the open ocean is totally different from regulating a domestic economy. And that is exactly why it's the perfect candidate for a unified global framework. We have the IMO's net zero framework. We have the European Union's emissions trading system rolling out.
Which are massively complex to implement.
But think about the strategic advantage here. Regulating a consolidated block of international shipping is far, far more viable than trying to align 195 different countries to regulate, say, 1 billion individual passenger cars across a messy patchwork of domestic laws. It gives regulators a single, cohesive target to force a massive technological transition.
I understand the political appeal of having a single cohesive target. I mean, it's much easier for regulators, but let's look at the proportional context that Captain Sharma lays out so clearly in the deep draft article. You mentioned 900 million tons. Yes, that's a large absolute number. But in the grand scheme of global greenhouse gases, shipping accounts for only 2.3 to 3% of emissions.
3% of the entire planet's emissions is still massive when we're talking about trying to hit very tight global climate goals.
But look at what that 3% actually achieves. Shipping moves 90% of global trade.
Right.
We are talking about the food on our tables, the fuel in our power grids, the raw materials for our infrastructure, the consumer goods in our homes. It literally powers the physical survival of the modern global economy on a mere fraction of the emissions pie. Contrast that with the real giants of global emissions. Coal, oil, and natural gas power plants account for over 38% of global CO2. Road transport is roughly 15%.
But those are dispersed, strictly domestic issues. A global body can't just mandate how a sovereign country runs its power grid.
Dispersed, yes, but vastly more destructive. And we have to talk about the unmatched mechanical efficiency of shipping. The specific metrics in the article are staggering. When you measure emissions by how much it takes to move 1 ton of cargo over 1 nautical mile, ships emit roughly 18 to 28 grams of CO2.
Okay, 18 to 28 grams.
Now compare that to heavy trucks on the highway, which emit 111 to 278 grams for that exact same ton mile. Or airplanes, which are emitting between 926 and 1111 grams. Shipping completely, utterly outclasses every other mode of transport. The extreme regulatory focus on this specific industry is driven by theater and optics. A gleaming new, green-fueled ship slicing through the ocean makes for a fantastic press release. Retrofitting a remote, aging coal plant in the middle of a continent doesn't get you on the front page.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The visibility of shipping isn't just about PR theater, it's about establishing a global testing ground for new technologies. Look at the IMO's April 2025 net zero framework. The initial goal there was to embed mandatory emissions limits and actual greenhouse gas pricing, a carbon tax, into international maritime law.
A highly controversial one.
Sure, but this is exactly the kind of market incentive needed to force a heavy, entrenched industry to act. If we can force international waters to decarbonize, we create a technological blueprint for everything else.
A blueprint that is currently struggling to survive contact with actual economic reality.
But the mechanisms being tested are brilliant. Take the Panama Canal's net zero slot, for example. They are literally reserving highly coveted weekly transit slots specifically for ships that meet strict green criteria. It's a massive financial and operational reward for early adopters.
If they can even get the fuel.
Right, but it forces the market to adapt because the cost of not adapting, waiting in line for days or weeks while your greener competitor sails right through the canal, is simply too high. It turns decarbonization into a competitive advantage.
I come at it from a different way. You point to the IMO's April 2025 net zero framework as this triumph of global cooperation. But let's look at what actually happened just a few months later. October 2025, the IMO held an extraordinary session, MEPC-ES.2, in London. This was supposed to be the historic moment where these binding net zero rules and the global carbon pricing mechanism were formally adopted, but they weren't.
Well, there was a deferral, yes. We know the process takes time.
It wasn't just a matter of taking time. It was a 57 to 49 vote to defer the adoption by a full year. And why did that happen? Because rushed, politically driven regulation always fails when it hits the brick wall of economic reality.
Or political reality.
Both. Heavy lobbying from the United States and several major flag states exposed that political caution will always step in when the economic pain becomes clear. The article notes that President Trump even dismissed the proposed carbon levy as a green new scam tax, explicitly arguing it would simply inflate costs for everyday consumers.
But political resistance from a specific administration doesn't invalidate the scientific and environmental necessity of the regulation. To me, it just proves that fossil fuel interests are deeply entrenched and, well, they will fight back when threatened.
But it isn't just politicians pushing back.
The actual operators, the people running the global fleets, are raising massive red flags. Just weeks before that IMO session, at the Cyprus Maritime Conference in Limassol, some of the most influential Greek ship owners in the world spoke up. We're talking about major players here: John Koustas, George Procopio, Thanasis Martinos.
Okay.
Greek-owned fleets dominate global shipping tonnage, so their perspective on the physical reality of the ocean is critical.
And naturally, incumbent operators with massive sunk costs in older vessels will resist regulation that costs them money. I mean, that's true of literally any industry facing a transition.
But listen to the specific, mechanical warning they gave. They argued that the framework completely lacks meaningful industry consultation. George Procopio used a brilliant term. He called the regulation a kolatumba.
Wait, a what? A kolatumba?
Yes, it's a Greek word for a somersault or a complete reversal. He was warning that these rushed mandates are a reversal that achieves the exact opposite of their environmental intent.
How does a carbon tax achieve the opposite of its intent?
Because of the logistics of fuel sourcing, if you force compliance targets that outpace global readiness and technical reality, you disrupt supply chains. Let's say a ship is mandated to burn a green fuel, but that fuel is only available in 3 ports worldwide.
Right. The infrastructure isn't there yet.
Exactly. So that ship now has to sail hundreds of extra miles out of its way, burning fuel the whole time, just to bunker the green fuel. You artificially inflate consumer costs, you create chaotic logistics, and you might actually raise total emissions through sheer operational inefficiency.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Reading through the deep dive piece and looking at the broader industry, I'm actually struck by how much capital is moving right now. The regulation is not outpacing technical reality, it is actively driving it. The political deferral in October doesn't erase the massive technological strides the industry has already made. Because these ambitious targets exist, the regulation is already working.
Working how? By forcing companies to issue optimistic press releases about goals set for 2050?
No, by forcing actual capital to flow toward actual physical solutions. Look at AP Moller-Maersk. They aren't just making announcements, they have secured long-term biomethanol supply contracts for their dual-fuel vessels starting in 2026. And look at the Japanese shipping majors, NYK Line, MOL, K-Line.
Yeah, they've been active.
Very active. They are physically developing ammonia-ready and hydrogen-ready vessels right now. They're testing onboard carbon capture and liquefaction systems. NYK has its Super Eco Ship 2050 initiative. Doesn't that prove the regulation is forcing innovation?
Those are highly subsidized prototypes in very limited pilot programs.
But they're the future, and they are attracting massive capital. ESG funds, environmental, social, and governance investment funds, are actively favoring these green leaders. The market is proving that it supports this transition. Capital is flowing away from the laggards and toward the companies that have credible, engineered decarbonization strategies. The regulations force the industry's hand, and the industry is proving that zero-emission shipping is technologically achievable.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You're looking at this from the shoreline or maybe from a corporate boardroom. From a boardroom, decarbonization looks like a simple spreadsheet exercise. Swap fuel A for fuel B.
It's not that simple, I know.
It's definitely not. But the deep draft analysis brings us back to the brutal sea reality. Let's carefully dismantle this silver bullet myth of new alternative fuels, one by one, and look at how they actually function.
The fuels are viable. They're being tested in real-world conditions right now.
Being tested on a short, heavily monitored route is very different from moving 90% of global trade safely across the Pacific Ocean in a winter storm. Let's start with LNG, liquefied natural gas. Yes, the industry loved it initially because it burns cleaner and cuts CO2. But there's a mechanical catch called methane slip.
Right. The unburned methane.
Exactly. Because these marine engines are massive and imperfect, a percentage of that natural gas escapes completely unburned straight out of the exhaust stack. And since methane traps over 80 times more heat in the atmosphere than CO2 in the short term, you're essentially plugging a leaky pipe by busting open a new, much worse one. The net climate benefit is highly debatable.
Okay, but LNG is largely seen as a transition fuel. What about methanol? Maersk is betting big on it, as you mentioned.
Methanol has a massive physics problem. It has roughly half the energy density of heavy fuel oil.
Which just means you need larger fuel tanks or more frequent bunkering stops, right? I mean, it's a logistical hurdle, not a total roadblock.
Do you know what larger fuel tanks mean on a commercial cargo ship? It means less cargo space. If you have to double the size of your fuel tanks to make the same voyage, you're displacing hundreds of containers of actual goods. It fundamentally attacks the core economic efficiency of the vessel. You'd need more ships to move the same amount of cargo, which, again, could drive total emissions back up.
But engineering always solves for density over time. What about ammonia? Regulators are heavily pushing ammonia because it doesn't contain carbon at all. It's zero carbon at the exhaust.
Ammonia is highly, highly toxic. It is a lethal gas.
I have to stop you there, though. We handle toxic chemicals in industrial land-based settings all the time. Factories pump, store, and process dangerous chemicals safely every single day. Why is it inherently different on a ship?
Because a factory on land isn't pitching and rolling 30 degrees in a North Atlantic gale. If there's a toxic leak in a factory in Germany, alarms go off. Workers evacuate to the parking lot, and specialized hazmat fire departments arrive in 5 minutes.
And that's true.
If an ammonia pipe ruptures on a ship in the middle of the ocean, there is no fire department. There is no parking lot to evacuate to. A spill doesn't just create an environmental cleanup, it is an immediate lethal threat to the isolated crew, and the toxic plume will kill the marine life around the vessel. The engines required to burn it without leaking are still highly experimental.
And hydrogen. We hear constant hype about the hydrogen economy.
Hydrogen is nearly impossible to store at scale on ocean-going tankers. To keep it liquid, it has to be kept at absolute zero temperatures, minus 253 degrees Celsius. That requires massive cryogenic containment vessels with incredibly thick insulation. You're talking about storage tanks that take up enormous volume. Plus, the sheer infrastructure required for a global cryogenic hydrogen bunkering network across thousands of ports simply does not exist.
But this is exactly what industrial innovation looks like. Yes, there are steep hurdles. Handling cryogenic fuels or toxic substances requires totally new safety protocols, but we didn't get to the moon by saying rockets were too volatile. We engineered safer systems.
It's the human element that is being totally ignored by the regulators here. There is an immense, under-discussed burden regarding crew training. We are asking everyday seafarers who are already stretched incredibly thin to become chemical engineers handling volatile experimental fuels.
It's a huge shift in skill sets, yes.
Massive. Hybrid systems, digital optimization, cryogenic handling, this requires recertifying hundreds of thousands of mariners. These seafarers are the ones who have to sleep 50 feet away from toxic ammonia tanks.
To mandate this transition from a comfortable regulatory desk in London while the fuel supply chains are incomplete and the safety protocols are untested is incredibly dangerous.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it sounds like we're using real but solvable technical hurdles as an excuse to avoid fundamental change. Yes, the training is hard. Yes, the physical fuel density requires major logistical redesigns of the ships. But is the alternative to just keep burning bottom-of-the-barrel heavy fuel oil forever? I worry that the industry leans on minor daily operational efficiencies to just stall the painful process of a real transition.
Minor operational efficiencies?
Yes. I mean, you read the maritime press, and we hear a lot about the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, the SEEMP, or using engine power limitation to cap a ship's top speed so it burns less fuel. And those are fine. But are we just literally polishing the propellers and scrubbing the hulls to distract from the fact that we need a total energy transition? When total decarbonization by 2050 is the mandate, pointing to a 2% efficiency gain from a new hull coating feels like a stalling tactic.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the sheer physical scale of what a 2% gain means in this specific industry? Operational efficiency isn't a stalling tactic. It's where the real, immediate, and safe carbon savings live right now, today. Let's take a VLCC, a very large crude carrier.
Which is a massive vessel. It's gargantuan.
We are talking about a ship longer than 3 football fields, carrying 2 million barrels of oil, running on a 30-day voyage across the Pacific. A ship like that burns 60 to 80 tons of fuel a single day.
Okay, so a massive carbon footprint.
Exactly. Now, if you apply advanced hull coatings that prevent barnacles from creating drag, or use air lubrication systems, which literally pump a carpet of microbubbles under the flat bottom of the hull so the ship glides on air to reduce friction,
Oh, wow, like an air hockey table.
essentially, yes, or simply use digital tools to optimize the routing around weather systems, you gain a 2 to 5% efficiency improvement. On 80 tons a day, over a 30-day voyage, you are saving dozens, sometimes hundreds of tons of CO2 on a single trip. And you are doing it today, right now, with existing tech, without risking the crew's lives with experimental toxic ammonia.
But at the end of the day, it's still burning fossil fuels. It's optimizing a fundamentally dirty system, not replacing it. It's making the horse and buggy slightly faster instead of inventing the car.
But the industry is not asking for a free pass to stay dirty. This is the crucial point from the deep draft article that completely destroys the scapegoat narrative. The maritime industry is already one of the most heavily monitored and transparent sectors on the planet. Class societies and regulators track absolutely everything.
It is heavily regulated, yes, with all the acronyms to prove it.
Exactly. The alphabet soup is real, but let's explain what it actually means. We have the EEDI, the Energy Efficiency Design Index. That mandates that any new ship built today has to meet strict carbon efficiency standards before it even touches the water. Then you have the CII, the Carbon Intensity Indicator. Regulators already grade these ships almost exactly like the Energy Star rating on your home refrigerator, from A to E.
Right.
It grades them based on how efficiently they transport goods year over year. If a ship gets a D or an E grade, it literally isn't allowed to operate normally until the owner submits a corrective action plan. They are already under a microscope.
Which, from my perspective, simply proves that stringent regulations can be implemented and monitored successfully. The industry adapts when forced.
It proves the shipping industry is complying, innovating, and pulling its weight. But here's where the profound, deeply frustrating unfairness lies. You have an industry that produces just 2.3% of global emissions, that is incredibly heavily monitored, actively graded on its efficiency, and currently optimizing every single drop of fuel just to keep 90% of global trade moving so the world doesn't starve.
Okay.
And regulators are demanding they rapidly transition to zero-carbon, highly dangerous experimental fuels right now. Meanwhile, a single 500-megawatt domestic coal plant somewhere inland continues to outpollute thousands of merchant ships combined, completely unbothered by global mandates. And coal still supplies roughly 35% of the entire world's electricity.
It is deeply frustrating that coal remains so dominant. I completely agree. The transition away from coal is far too slow.
Road transport produces nearly 6 billion tons of CO2 annually compared to shipping's roughly 1 billion. Plus, road transport causes massive direct urban air pollution and immediate health crises in cities. Yet shipping is painted as the climate villain because it's a faceless international target. The IMO doesn't have a domestic constituency of angry commuters who will vote a politician out of office for raising their daily costs.
That's a very fair point about the politics.
Right. Regulating shipping is politically safe for domestic leaders. But jeopardizing the global supply chain just to satisfy a regulatory target while ignoring your own massive domestic polluters is fundamentally bad policy.
When you step back and look at all of this, it really forces you to weigh the pace of innovation against the immediate economic and physical risks. I think we have reached a really fascinating crux here. To synthesize my view, despite the clear technical hurdles with fuel density, the very real crew training challenges, and the complexities of international politics, international shipping has to remain a primary target for global climate regulation. Yes, it's only 2.3% of emissions, but nearly 1 billion tons of CO2 is a massive raw number.
It is.
And because of its global nature, unified frameworks like the IMO targets and the European trading systems are uniquely viable here in a way they aren't for fragmented domestic industries. These regulations, even if they hit bumps like the October deferral, are essential to force the market's hand, as we've seen with the massive capital investments from Maersk and NYK, setting the bar high, is what drives the technological breakthroughs we desperately need to eventually decarbonize everything else.
And coming at it from my side, while the shipping industry absolutely must continue its heavy R&D investments and push for every ounce of operational efficiency, which it is already doing with tools like air lubrication and the CII ratings, it is currently serving as a highly convenient political scapegoat. The extreme regulatory pressure is driven by optics and the political ease of targeting a faceless international industry that operates out of sight. This theatrical focus completely distracts global attention and crucial capital from the vastly harder to regulate, massively polluting domestic sectors like coal power generation and road transport, which represent the actual lion's share of the climate crisis.
I will certainly acknowledge that the strongest point of convergence in our discussion really centers on the seafarers themselves. We both agree that the industry is deeply engaged in this transition, but the alternative fuels on the horizon, the toxic ammonia, the cryogenic hydrogen, the low-density methanol, present unprecedented logistical, financial, and above all, physical safety hurdles for the crews who actually have to operate these vessels in hostile ocean conditions. The human element cannot simply be regulated away from a desk in London.
Exactly. A true transition requires vast physical infrastructure. We need massive new bunkering terminals in Rotterdam, Singapore, and Los Angeles, not just unfunded mandates. And it requires holding all sectors, especially the massive domestic ones, proportionately accountable.
It really reflects the sheer complexity of global climate politics. The optics of a smoking ship funnel make it an incredibly easy target for a press release, while the hidden, unmatched efficiency of a massive vessel moving 2 million barrels of oil across a stormy ocean with a fraction of the emissions of a truck fleet is completely ignored in the public discourse.
Which is exactly why critical analysis like Captain Sharma's deep draft article is so vital. It forces us to look past the self-congratulatory LinkedIn posts and the green PR and look closely at the actual physical metrics of maritime efficiency versus the reality of global emissions.
I highly suggest our listeners explore the deep draft source material for themselves to dig deeper into the actual mechanics and numbers we discussed today. Because at the end of the day, when you look at the immense, generational project of cleaning up our global atmosphere, it leaves you wondering, are we finally shutting down the main factory furnace? Or are we just obsessively polishing the bumper of the delivery truck parked out back?
That is a question definitely worth keeping in mind the next time a shiny new green ship makes the headlines.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.